Hello, this is episode 2 of Sports Done Smart. This is David Potter. I'm with BL Analytics and also an editor with Rock Chalk Talk. I've been incredibly lucky to get two great guests on in both my first two episodes of the show here. Last week we talked with John Gasway from ESPN, and today I have Jesse Newell with the Kansas City Star. He's the beat writer for the Star for the Kansas Jayhawks. So I appreciate you coming on with me today, Jesse.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, David.
Sure, absolutely. So just for the viewers and listeners out there, I don't just have him on because I'm a KU alum and a Jayhawks fan. Jesse Newell is unique in that he's not your everyday beat reporter. Jesse, you've managed to find a way to integrate rate statistics, tempo-free statistics into your writing in a way that you don't typically see from other beat reporters. And I know it's gotten you recognized. You were the AP Sports Writers Beat Reporter of the Year, I believe. I know you had started out in Emporia, and you've worked your way up to Lawrence and to Topeka. Now, the biggest media market in KU's footprint and the Kansas City Star. So clearly, it's been pretty well received. But was using those kinds of numbers and that kind of thinking always something that you wanted to work into your writing, or was it something that evolved over time as you got into your journalism career?
Well, I started off kind of in a bad spot, or a good spot, however you want to consider it, because my dad was a math teacher growing up. So, I mean, I was a little bit had that sort of notion, that sort of stuff in my head, and grew up loving numbers. I mean, a lot of people talk about this, baseball cards and reading the back of that and kind of how always having that sort of thinking. But honestly, it's kind of crazy. I was with KUsports.com. I wasn't too much into it. And as we know, the advanced numbers have really changed over time. Just the access to them, KenPom kind of exploding, and then these other sites that are out there. But I was at KUsports.com. I was kind of a moderator on the message boards at the time, and there was a guy named Jay Fish. He's a super smart guy, and we're talking about the Royals and them signing Mike Jacobs. And at the time, I loved this signing. I was like, oh, I'm a big power hitter. The Royals never have power hitters. And he was like, man, do you understand, on base percentage, do you understand what really helps teams win? And so ever since that point, when the Mike Jacobs trade for Leo Nunez totally blew up in the Royals' face, I was like, man, there's got to be some better things out there, exactly what he was talking about, to analyze sports. And since then, I really took to the advanced numbers with college basketball too, and just trying to, again, be smarter, I guess, about this, or doing things in a more scientific way. We hear a lot of the narrative, the kind of the tired old cliches about what happens and what makes teams win. And I think kind of digging into the numbers and figuring out really maybe what does it, and kind of get to the level of what we know about basketball, that's kind of been important to me. And that's kind of why you see some of those things. I thought the previous Royals writer, Andy McCullough, did a great job of this, and I try to do the same thing, which is to touch on the advanced stats and kind of get up to them, but don't go overboard with them where you lose your audience. I think there's a big time challenge to kind of translate these numbers so that they're available and accessible to the everyday fan, and not get overwhelmed and bogged down by them at the same time.
Right. And I think it's probably been an easier transition for baseball writers to get into numbers like WAR and OPS plus, whatever you want to use, just because numbers have always been a part of baseball. Even as a kid, everyone in baseball knew what slugging percentage was. And while that's not a great metric, it's at least a more complicated metric than anything you saw in any other sport. It involved a more complicated formula than, just points divided by games or something like that. So I think their transition's been a little easier, but it seems to me with basketball and football that the use of advanced numbers has almost been a separate pursuit from the normal media. There's the standard way of looking at things that you get from most of the people on the radio and TV and your average beat writer, and then it almost has to be a specialty to really focus on the more advanced metrics like you see at KenPom. So I think it's been interesting that you've been able to bridge that gap so successfully. Have you received much pushback from readers or from editors and saying, I don't know what you're talking about, just, stick to the game, or stick to the type of things I'm used to hearing? Or has it generally been positive where people are enjoying learning about these types of things?
I think it's generally been positive. The thing about it is, what happens nowadays, I think more than ever, when we have Twitter and Facebook and branding and everybody knows, you almost kind of know what you're getting from me, I guess, if that's your case. So if you want more of the standard coverage, I think there's places out there for you. You know what I mean? I think that there's always spots where you're not going to get the advanced stats sort of thing. But I think, at least now to the point, I think people understand kind of what I'm about and what they might get with one of my stories. And if that's not their cup of tea, then there's plenty of other places online to get other things out there that are available as well. So not too much pushback. I think going back to what you're talking about with football and basketball against baseball, the thing that makes baseball so great with stats is that almost everything in the sport is individualized. Almost everything is, if you're up at the plate and you hit a home run, we can credit that to you and only you. You know what I mean? You saw the fastball coming, you hit it over the fence. In basketball, it's just so much more complicated because, okay, you make a three-pointer, that's great, that does go on you, but what about the guy that set the screen? I mean, can we give full credit to that guy? Or what about the pass that he gave you to give the open three? Did he get more credit for that, or do you get more credit for that? When you're standing in the batter's box, you basically know that you were the one that did the action. Where we get complicated with football and basketball, and why I think there's still a little bit more pushback, is that we are still trying to figure out how much credit do we give this person compared to that person. And at the same time, when we're talking about WAR, and I use this example all the time with baseball. In baseball, it's a little bit simpler as a GM. You just stack your lineup with great hitters. If you stack your lineup with 9 great hitters, each hitter will make the other hitter better. Whereas basketball, if you give yourself 5 Michael Jordans, it's not a very good team. You need a guy to stand in the corner and be a floor spacer. You need a guy to set some screens. You need a defensive rebounder. So getting those pieces to fit and getting these sort of metrics where we say this person has X number of WAR or win shares or whatever in basketball is just so much more complicated because those pieces have to fit together different in basketball than they do in a sport like baseball.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And, it's something that really basketball has a long way to go with. And really, I know there's some debate on the defensive metrics in baseball, but I think baseball's got a long way to go, is that there really isn't a good way to measure defense. You can look at blocks and steals, but those don't really tell you the whole story. Travis Relaford was an excellent perimeter defender for Kansas, but didn't put up great block or steal numbers. So there's nothing numerical you can point to say that he was a great defender. And I know, people are doing some work with looking at, which lineups allowed the most points or allowed the highest field goal percentage, things like that when they're out on the court, and that can help isolate it a bit. But to your point about, the basketball team needing different types of players, it's really, defense is something that's really hard to use analytics to pinpoint when it comes to basketball, just because there aren't really any great numbers attached to it.
Yeah, it's the same thing we're talking about. It's trying to figure out, there's really no statistics right now that can kind of come and all encompass those sorts of things. You mentioned Travis Relaford. Andrew Wiggins is the same way, in the NBA even now, and the same way with KU, where you have a long defender, you have a guy with a great reach, you have a guy that slides his feet well, you have a guy that really looks the part of a great defender, but doesn't create steals and doesn't get many rebounds. And so you're kind of still left scratching your head saying, okay, are we just totally underestimating this guy via the advanced stats, or are we overrating him based on the physical tools that he does have? So yeah, defense is a big time challenge when it comes to basketball. And again, I think all the knowledge that we have now was built on the knowledge that we had a few years ago. So, I mean, obviously, I think things will continue to move on. Some of that sports VU technology, I know Duke's using it, and some of the spatial tracking can only help us as well. But we might just be at the very beginning of that. And like you said with baseball, it probably is going to get better from here. But those are the challenges of it. But kind of to your point earlier, I still think that there's smarter ways to look at things, maybe rather than the typical thing that you hear from most people out there, and kind of just the basic rate average statistics. And so even if we can't tell everything about a team, even numbers like you're talking about with 2-point percentage against, or block rate, or 3-point rate against, I mean, even using some of those statistics, free throw rate is a great one. I love to use defensive free throw rate. Even using some of those, I think maybe can get us a little bit further than what some of the other ones can, and maybe take it a step further in analysis than what's been available before.
Right. And on the subject of possible limitations of the advanced stats and the metrics that are out there right now, one subject specific to Kansas that's been of great debate, especially last year, and it kind of carried over into this year, is the idea of how many three-pointers a team should be shooting. In general, the analytics community, or whatever you want to call it, is very much pro three-pointer, and with good reason. Because if you look at the numbers, for how often team or a player is going to hit a three-pointer versus a jump shot that's worth one fewer point from just a few feet in, the three-pointer is obviously a much more efficient shot. And that's led to a lot of frustration amongst at least certain Kansas fans and fans of the sport overall, with how relatively little Bill Self's teams shoot three-pointers compared to the way other teams are shooting them now, which that rate keeps increasing. I've heard it referred to as a three-point revolution in college basketball. I know you've been on team Free the Three, as it's been called, but then we've also seen that three-point attempt rate creep up for Kansas this year. Do you feel like they're reaching a point where they're shooting about the right number of threes, or would you like to see them continue to shoot more?
Yeah, you haven't seen me talk nearly as much about it this year, just because that number has gone way up this year from years past. If you look, it's by far the highest number that Bill Self's had in his career at Kansas. And again, part of that is it seems like it would be just the fact that more, like you said, more teams are shooting higher percentage of threes in college basketball. I think we're reaching a point where the line probably is going to be moved back here very soon, just because teams are hitting the shot at a greater rate than they were before, and players are becoming more skilled, and it's becoming a valuable shot, that sort of thing. But my main argument last year for it, and again, it's the reason you haven't heard much of this year, is just how poor KU's offense was 2-point shooting wise, and still continuing to force the ball inside when you had another legitimate option with three-pointers when they were, a top 45 three-point shooting team. Last year, this team was 234th in 2-point percentage. And I just thought some of the arguments that Bill Self was making for always playing inside out and always going to be going home sad in the tournament if you shoot threes. I mean, it just seemed like kind of old and dated arguments that weren't really well thought out, and kind of just more a fact of him going back to what had always worked for him. And again, we can't blame coaches for that. I mean, Bill Self has had great 2-point offenses year after year after year after year. So this was probably, to me, more of just a discussion last year of, if you have a team that's struggling to score inside, if you have a team where Perry Ellis is getting blocked a lot and you don't have a second scorer next to him, should you consider taking more three-pointers to maybe ease some of the burden on that side of your offense, while also taking advantage of having shooters? Because we see in the Big 12, there's a lot of teams that do not have any shooters. I mean, K-State has no three-point shooters. West Virginia has no three-point shooters. They all would die for Brandon Green, and he basically, gets played, 10 or 12 minutes a game on good games, that sort of thing. So to me, it was just more a matter of being more open-minded with this. I reported in my game story last year from Wichita Eagle, KU fired up 4 3-pointers against Wichita State in the early minutes, and he came back to the bench, and I was right behind the bench, and he said to his players, how soft are you guys? All you want to do is shoot threes. And again, it's that sort of mindset that I'm not sure that you want to have that when that's one of your team's most valuable weapons. Now, going from last year to this year, obviously that's changed. I mean, I wrote an article about this last week. KU is playing more outside-in sort of offense. They're playing a lot of high ball screens with Frank Mason and Perry Ellis. And if you watch Coach Self, when KU does shoot threes, he gets a little bit upset, but you can see for the most part he bites his tongue and doesn't scream at guys for doing that. And I see this team with a really free mind. I mean, this team, Devontae Graham doesn't hesitate on threes. Wayne Selden doesn't hesitate on threes, and I think this team's offense has benefited from it. Not only have they taken advantage of the fact that they're a top 10 three-point shooting team in the nation, I think that's also eased the burden of their 2-point offense. They haven't had to shoot as many 2-pointers, and in turn, that 2-point percentage has shot up, and they've been better on that area as well. So I don't think this is ever a matter of, I'm never going to argue that teams, every three you shoot is a better offense. I mean, obviously there's a limit to where you want to be. I think more arguing last year was just saying, hey, KU's not close to the NCAA average here. And they're a better than average 3-point shooting team. And they're a worse than average 2-point shooting team. You probably shouldn't completely dismiss the fact that if KU could creep up its 3-point percentage, it could be helped not only 3-point shooting wise, but ease some of the burden on its 2-pointers, because the inside guys really weren't scoring at a level that Bill Self was accustomed to seeing.
And this is something you just kind of touched on with your answer, but it's something that perplexed me last year, and I'm still trying to sort out exactly what the difference is. For the most part, this is the same group, same core group of players that we saw last year. It's Mason, Graham, Selden, Ellis, and as the season's gone on, increasingly Lucas. Last year there was some Cliff Alexander in there. This year there's been a little of Bragg and Diallo, but for the most part it's the same guys. Last year it was a terrible two-point shooting team. Wayne Selden, I think, was under 40% at the rim, if I'm not mistaken. And then this year we've seen that number right back in line with where Bill Self's teams usually are, which is in at least the top 50, if not even higher, in two-point percentage. So do you think that this year's improvement is a result of them opening up the offense and Bill Self allowing them to shoot more threes, or do you think that it's just been the natural progression, the players having another year of experience and getting better, or some combination of that? Or do you think there's another factor that's leading to that? Because, I mean, that was by far the worst two-point shooting group that we've ever seen at Kansas under Bill Self. And now with the same group of guys, we're right back to where you'd expect them to be.
Yeah, I think like a lot of things, it's a combination of a lot of little factors. I think for one, you're right, that KU is shooting the ball better, period. A guy like Landon Lucas is finishing better at the rim. Carlton Bragg has been a nice addition there in the limited minutes he's had. He's a really good finisher at the rim, even if it doesn't always seem like it. So there's part of that. I wrote an article last week, too, before KU's game against UConn. I think this is a big part of it, is that the 24-second shot clock in the World University games, KU's coaches kind of started to brainstorm a little bit. How can you get quicker shots off? How can you become more guard-oriented? How can you rely more on drives like you see in the NBA? What kind of offense can KU run to get that going? And in doing that, they use that sort of, like I'm talking about, high ball screen, have Frank Mason drive around Perry Ellis. If it's not there, you throw back to Perry, and he can create against a big man who's charging at him, which is a really good mismatch to create. And the fact that it worked so well, they went 8-0. They ran effective offense. They ran efficient offense. All those things worked together. It kind of gave them a free trial run at this offense, and they said, this guy kind of works. So Bill Self still has some of these elements in there. I mean, obviously there's still some plays he has. You see neck is one of them where you can isolate on the post. You can throw it over the top to Perry Ellis. He can get his sort of easy angle play. But we're seeing way fewer angle plays from KU than you saw in years past, just because they don't have the finishers in the past, and I think the coaching staff is catering to the strengths of Frank Mason and Perry Ellis. Now, the two-point percentage has really shot up. I think it was in the 80s or 90s about a month ago, and now I think it's around 34th or 39th, 40th, somewhere in that range. So it's definitely shot up. They've obviously increased it in the past month or so where they've gotten better, but I think it's just a matter of mostly the coaching staff giving this a trial run with the 24-second shot clock, knowing a shot clock was going to be limited this year as well, and then seeing its success and saying, hey, let's run a lot more of these plays. And I actually did a video about their down play that they run. Bill Self always kind of looks like he's dribbling the basketball, but basically that's what it is. They put their two shooters in the corners, three-point shooters, just in case those guys cheat too much. If you want to cheat off Brandon Green, they'll just pitch it to Brandon Green for an open three. And then Frank Mason drives around a high ball screen from Perry Ellis. If it's not there, he throws it back to Perry Ellis, and I had a video of 9 different ways KU scored off that one play. I mean, it doesn't always have to be really complicated. I mean, KU is just using the strengths of the two players it has, Frank Mason and that Perry Ellis, the two best players it has, and then putting, like we talked about, the complementing, putting two shooters in the corners to space the floor and complement it really well. It's a really effective, simple play, and KU is going more to that type of play this year. It's kind of what you see more with Iowa State and Notre Dame. They don't have those dominant post scorers, but they space it so well that there's driving openings and there's openings for guys to get to the rim. I think that's why we've seen KU's 2% shoot up.
All right. And it's interesting that you mentioned they made that change based on their success at the World University Games, because there was a period of time where things were starting to look a little dark for Kansas this year. They lost 3 of 5. Oklahoma looked unstoppable. I think a lot of different people felt like the Big 12 title streak was probably over. And it seemed like they had reverted to last year's tendencies of just trying to force the ball to the rim. Frank Mason driving kind of wildly toward the rim, just hoping to make a circus layup. And they weren't doing those things that had done so well for them at the World University Games, at Maui, and now that they're doing again right now. Do you think that was just a little slump, or I know there were some reports that maybe Frank Mason was a little banged up. Do you have any thoughts on what the reasoning for that lull was, where they were having so much trouble scoring and they looked like they'd gone right back to last year's offense for a while?
Yeah, I think a combination of a lot of things. Again, you talked about Frank Mason. He talked about a leg issue, that kind of a mysterious leg issue. He wasn't talking about his elbow was obviously hurt. And I think there was a lot of worry at that time because you don't figure he's going to get healthier by playing 2 games a week. But obviously he did. Devontae Graham has been playing on a different level. When we talk about this, Bill Self, I thought at the time, I was like, the guy, I don't know. It seemed like an excuse, but he talked about this big lull that KU had in late January. But it sure looked like he was right. I mean, the team has been more energized lately. I mean, the guards seem like they have more life, energy. They can guard better. They're quicker. They get off the dribble better, that sort of thing. So it seemed like a little bit of slump in that regard. And then Bill Self, one thing he does preach a lot, and I don't think that KU was following through with at the time, is that he always preaches drive to pass. I don't think that's been the best for KU. They haven't always had the best guys doing that, but then again, they haven't always had the best spacing to do that as well. When you get guys in the corners, that's really when you have good opportunities to drive to pass, because if you always know there's going to be guys in the corners, if you can drive and create help and always know somebody's going to be there to shoot a 3, that's really where you get some of your easiest 3-point attempts. But since that point, KU has driven to pass better, and you've seen that, like you said, with Frank Mason. Frank Mason is really not effective, though, and a lot of people don't know it, scoring at the rim in non-transition situations. He struggles to score against shot blockers. He's not tall. That's really been a struggle on his part. But since then, I don't think that KU really has as much of that problem. And again, that kind of goes back to the 3-point shooting, because when you drive to pass, when you do those kickouts, and when you're confident enough to shoot those 3s instead of pump faking and driving inside, that helps out your offense. It seems to me it's not a perfect parallel, but it's almost like football. You run to pass or you pass to run. It can be complementary either way. But the more that KU is kicking out to 3-pointers and making those 3-pointers, the more that teams have to respect that. And then the more open the inside is for guys like Frank Mason and Perry Ellis and Devontae Graham to score when they do drive in there. So a little combination of everything, but I think driving to pass has really benefited this team. And when you drive to pass, you've got to shoot the open 3. That's the fact of the matter. KU has passed up a lot of open 3s. They did a lot earlier this year. They did a lot last year. It doesn't seem like they're doing that much lately, and that real offense has seemed to be really on an uptick in the last few weeks.
Yeah, and I would agree. It looks like they're back to playing that more free and spaced out type of offense than they were during that period. But following your content and reading your articles, and then you're listening to your podcast during that time when things looked a little more dire for Kansas. I know that you were, and rightfully so, fairly critical of some of the things that Self was doing, both offensively, the things we were talking about, passing up open 3-point opportunities, leaving a potential rim protector in Diallo or Hunter Mickelson on the bench in favor of Landon Lucas, who at that point really was offering no shot blocking whatsoever. And I know from my experience writing for Rock Chalk Talk that anytime you bring up a criticism, even if there's some valid data or science behind it, you kind of get that immediate pushback of, well, I'll start listening to you when you have a national championship, when you've got 12 straight Big 12 title rings. And did you get much of that at that time, or were, like you said earlier, people tend to know what they're getting from you? Were people generally pretty responsive to the kind of criticisms that you had of the way Self was running the team at that point?
Yeah, it is really difficult to have that, because there always is that appeal to authority. And I think it's always the danger is that people automatically can say that. And you're right, there's nothing I can say to that, because there's no 10th year coaches out there that are also writing for the Kansas City Star about Bill Self. I mean, I think that's why I try to focus mostly on the numbers, because you know what? I don't know as much about basketball as Bill Self. I think that's pretty evident. I think everybody would admit to that. But, I would argue that I at least have a familiarity with the advanced stats enough to at least pick up topics that are discussion points. And I think at the time that most KU fans were questioning the same thing as well. Now, this is not his typical team. This team doesn't look like it's going to win the Big 12. This team does have some issues and problems. But again, Bill Self, like he normally is, was proven right. I mean, the team was in a little bit of a lull. They didn't seem to be having the same type of energy that they had early in the season. And the thing I didn't anticipate, and this is what you talked about with the advanced stats and maybe not always picking up on everything is by putting Landon Lucas in the lineup, that KU could succeed so much with a 2-point defense that doesn't have a rim protector. And the basic reason for that in my mind was just that the reason Kansas had been successful so many years was by having Cole Aldrich, by having Jeff Withey, by having Joel Embiid, and by being able to recruit that player and then basically stick him back as an anchor in the back and say, try to score over this guy. It's not going to work. So I probably was undervaluing the potential defense that Landon Lucas could provide and how KU doesn't have to trap ball screen or doesn't have to trap the post anymore, how he is an absolute vacuum on defensive rebounding, which has given KU an element it needs. So I didn't really think that he was a horrible compliment to Perry Ellis. I just think he was the best compliment because I thought Sheck Diallo could give a lot of those things while also providing that shot blocking presence. So as far as the criticism goes, it's tough. I mean, it's a fine line to draw, but the bottom line too is that there are not a lot of people out there that that are critical of Bill Self. And I think at a very base level, and maybe this is me thinking about it the wrong way, but the guy makes $5 million a year. If he can't take me wondering something in my mind where I'm looking statistically and saying, I wonder about this, or I wonder about that, or I wonder what would happen if this happened, then he probably shouldn't be the $5 million a year man to make that for KU. So there's a lot of places out there to get, hey, Bill Self is great content. And so showing the other side of it, I've always heard a term that in journalism, it's never bad to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think that's always the thing that's kind of always been in the back of my mind with this. Not that Bill Self needs poking, or not that when they're going well that you don't write articles to say that they're doing correct things, but when there are questions, to be the person that can bring up things that you're seeing or being out there. I mean, my responsibility is to the readers. It's not to KU Athletics. It's not to Bill Self. It's not to the coaching staff. It's to the readers, and it's to the people that they've hired me to serve. So you kind of have to balance a fine line there. Obviously I have to show up to all the press conferences, and I hope that Bill Self knows from working with me over time that he respects me enough to talk to me then and answer my phone calls, all those sorts of things. But I think at a bottom line that to me, if I'm just doing that, if I'm using the numbers to point out facts that I think where KU could be better or could be worse, that sort of thing, then that's just part of my job. And I hope that other people see it that way as well, just because, like I said, I'm covering the team and my responsibilities to the readers, not to KU in particular.
Right. And I do think you've done a fantastic job of striking that balance of, looking at things that need maybe further examination when things aren't going so well, while still, you write plenty of content about, the plays that they're running that are working right now, about how they shut down UConn just the other day. So, I think that's part of the reason that I wanted to have you on the show, is that you do look at things in a different way. You're not afraid to, criticize the way that the things that have always been done. Even if you can anticipate some, like you said, that appeal to authority of people who just are never going to. I think there are people out there who are just never going to accept the opinion of someone who's looking at a stat sheet over someone who's had experience playing at a higher level, even if what that person with the basketball experience is saying is not even supported by the data that we have.
Yeah, a couple of things I thought of too. I mean, I heard this about Andy McCullough. I don't remember who told me the story, but I guess, and again, this is like secondhand, so maybe it did happen, maybe it didn't. But same sort of thing with Dayton Moore. He says something like, "Man, when the Royals are playing well, you're really writing positive stuff, and when the Royals aren't playing well, you're really writing negative stuff about us." And Andy, from what I was told, like kind of said, "Well, good that I'm doing my job. I'm telling what's happening when it is going well, and then when it's not." I mean, that's kind of what newspapers are. Again, it's not to pick on people when things are going bad, but it is just that's your job. That's what separates Andy McCullough when he was with the Star from Royals.com. And again, I know they try to separate those things out, or maybe a better example would be Therese Paylor from, Chiefs.com, that sort of thing, where that it's not going to be sugar-coated. I mean, that's the sort of thing, just not sugar-coated. And I think the other aspect of this as well, and again, if you're Bill Self and you make $5 million a year, and you know how awesome a national championship is, and you know what success does to you and how it changes the town, how it changes Lawrence, and you are at the top of your profession, you are going to be a future Hall of Famer, And all these tools are out there, and all these numbers are out there, and you maybe that's not a strength of yours. You're kind of an old school ball coach. You've done things one way. If you are not at least examining these sorts of things, if you're not at least thinking about how can I improve, how can I get better, what are some things I'm not considering, what are some things that other things are doing, why is Iowa State a better offense than me 4 years in a row with Fred Hoiberg there? If you're not examining these things in your mind, then to me you're not doing what you should be doing for your basketball team, for your basketball program. And so again, while I'm bringing all these things up, and it might sound critical at times, it might sound like, oh, there goes Jesse again, writing about how KU's terrible when they're going to go out and be 32-4 again, whatever the case may be. I think the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, I kind of think of it that way too. I mean, if Bill Self is not considering these things, if he doesn't have a KenPom subscription, which I know he does, even if he doesn't love the advanced stats all the time, if he doesn't have a KenPom subscription, then somebody needs to be getting him one. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. And if he's not considering all these other things that are coming out with, I mean, think about the Spurs. I mean, the guy was in his, R.C. Buford was in his wedding. You know what I mean? If he's not considering some of these things that have led the Spurs to championships with the analytics and the thoughts and the processes that they go through, then what's he doing for Kansas? Why is he not thinking of these sorts of things as well? So to me, there's always some sort of ground to stand on, I feel like, because even if it comes across as criticism, to me it's just coming across as the point of view that I have that might be a new way of thinking. It might be the newest way of thinking, or the way that NBA teams are thinking, or the way that the analytically minded teams are thinking. And I don't think that's a bad thing to bring up, even if sometimes it does seem crazy, and even if I get proven wrong. I mean, I've admitted over and over and over again that I thought Kansas was not going to win the Big 12 this year. That was absolutely wrong. But again, some of the reason for KU switching over from a really mediocre offense to a really dominant offense has been some of the things that more three-point shooting, driving to pass, some of those things that could have been advocated for a couple months ago.
Yeah, and I was right there with you. I was at one point completely convinced that it was Oklahoma's conference to lose, and at one point I think Ken Pomeroy even had KU finishing two full games below Oklahoma, and so I think it has been a great turnaround. So that, I know we're kind of running out of time here, but one thing I did want to ask, just because you obviously have a lot more access to the program to Bill Self than I do. We see Bill Self do things like leaving his starters in to play a lot of minutes, when modern sports science says, really stresses how much of a negative impact fatigue can have and how important rest is. And we see, that he's a little reluctant to shoot threes, and some of the things that modern analytics say that we should be doing more of. In your opinion, is he behind the times at all in terms of new developments in sports and some of the newer ways that people are looking at things, including, like you mentioned, teams like the Spurs, who he's friends with with some higher ups in that organization. Do you think that he's been slow to adapt to some of those things, or do you think that maybe he's got just a different he's looking at all those things but is maybe drawing different conclusions, or finding his own way to interpret them?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, because you can go on a lot of different things and maybe answer this a lot of different ways. I just had a story last week about this change that they had with the World University Games and how they're playing more outside-in sort of offense. The thing is, we talked so much about this last year, how KU probably shouldn't be running its offense through its big men. There was no reason to run its offense through the big men with two post guys in there when the five-man was not scoring. Like Jamari Traylor was basically a non-threat to score. So he makes a change like that. Again, not 100%, but they're doing a lot more of that, and then nobody really talks about it because it's just kind of one of those under-the-radar things that we don't really bring up that often. But in that way, I think he does adapt. And if you talk to his assistant coaches, I talked to Curtis Townsend, Norm Roberts this last week for that story, and they talked about how this is another example of Bill Self adapting to the times, adjusting to fit his personnel, doing those sorts of things when he needs to do them. I think there's some aspects, like we talked about, that there might be. We know Bill Self in a lot of areas, and this is a positive quality, this is not a negative quality, but is stubborn in a lot of areas, almost to a fault. And the other thing is, the thing that he has done year after year after year, his style, his method, it works. I mean, they have won the Big 12 Conference 12 straight times. So there's also a fine line. While, crazy people like me might say, oh, try this, try that, do this, do that. The thing is, Bill Self has won 12 straight Big 12 titles by doing things mostly the same every single year, running practice the same way, running this play this way. So I don't know if I can blame him for saying, wait a minute, I'm not going to go be Fred Hoiberg. I'm not going to look at his offense and say, I need to be Fred Hoiberg. Now, maybe, like I said, maybe he can take a play off Fred Hoiberg. Maybe he can spread the floor a little bit more. Maybe he can talk to Fred Hoiberg about a play like he did before the Oklahoma game there. All those sorts of things. Maybe you can incorporate little things. But the way he's played, and I mean, especially defensively, the way they play defensively, especially without a rim protector, the way that, I mean, you look at their defense. I mean, Wayne Selden's not a great slider. Perry Ellis is who he is defensively. Landon Lucas is a good position defender, but doesn't block shots. And then Devontae Graham and Perry Ellis, and Frank Mason, we saw that they had some weaknesses early in the season. I mean, to get that defense into a top 10 sort of defense after being 38th about a month and a half ago, I mean, it's an amazing accomplishment. The guy is a savant guru when it comes to defense. And so there's kind of that balance to be struck. So, I mean, he obviously follows the numbers. He obviously knows the numbers. He knows things like rebound percentage are better than he always preaches that to us about how you shouldn't look at a team out rebounding another. So he's developed on those sorts of things, and he's allowed his team to shoot more threes. So I think he has changed, and that's a positive. And KU has seen a lot of positive benefits from that. But I also think that he is still reluctant to go all the way full bore in a different direction that has won him so many games over such a long period of time. And you know what? I don't blame him a bit for that, because KU, year after year after year, has been successful. They turn around again this year, and he once again has moved himself into the conversation for National Coach of the Year. It's for being a little bit flexible while also doing those same things that have won him conference titles and also a national title in the not so recent past.
All right, well, I will finish up with one more kind of basic question, and that's just because we're talking to you while Kansas is in the middle of a tournament run here. Are there any other teams, especially teams in on Kansas' half of the bracket, that concern you in particular more so than others right now? Any teams you don't want to face? So is maybe Maryland one of those, or who do you most want to see, and who do you least want to see as if you're someone who's a KU fan right now in the tournament?
Yeah, as I say, if you're a KU fan and you're looking at it, I think you see all these upsets and all these seeds going down, or I guess, RPI upsets, if you will. But KU's half of the bracket really didn't have that. You thought maybe Wichita State could make a run, even though that might not have been a gift either. But I think Villanova's a really good team, for one. They moved up to 4th in KenPom after that game yesterday, and a team that obviously shoots a lot of threes, but a team that is a high-quality level team. I wouldn't think that game would be more than about a 2-point spread in Louisville. So that's a team I think that should concern KU fans, just because it's a tough team. I mean, you're going to have to face a tough team usually to get to the Final Four. Even when 2008, when Davidson happened, that was a 10 seed, but you didn't know the best player in the world was on that team at the time. The thing about Maryland, I do like KU's matchup against Maryland, just because I think Maryland is one of those teams that usually is overrated by the human polls, whereas their underlying advanced numbers aren't as good. But the one big issue is Melo Trimble. And if you ask Bill Self, if you got him to the side in a quiet moment and said, hey, what do you really struggle with defensively? What's something that your team doesn't do as well? And he would say, ball screen defense and guys on the perimeter being able to adjust, and a really good playmaking point guard that can drive in there and create for others, pass or score. And that really kind of fits Melo Trimble to a T. So that's the one concern I have for KU against Maryland. I like the matchup. I like them being able to score against Maryland, but I think that's the one thing when we always talk about matchups in the NCAA tournament, that sort of thing. The Melo Trimble one for KU might be difficult. So it's good for KU that they have a couple days to prepare, a couple ways to figure out how they want to defend him. But that's the kind of player that could give them issues, even though I still am going to pick KU and think they'll advance at least to the Elite Eight and probably further than that.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time today, Jesse. You're welcome back anytime. And, I keep up the great work with the Kansas City Star, and wish you the best of luck in the future as you continue to write about sports in a more scientifically driven way than what we usually get to see out of beat reporters. So I thank you for all that you do in covering Kansas and the sport of basketball and football as well.
I appreciate it, David, and I loved watching the cats in the background. It was great.
All right, thank you.